maybe I'll cut this out, but I've lost quite a few female friends. Funny that they were all girls, since October 7th. And I lost one friend, a French Algerian friend, and I so understood it. I was like, of course you're going to be pro-Palestine. Like, of course.
But why can't you, is there no ability to talk and find a common ground?
100%. And I don't know why I get so emotional talking about this stuff. It was very upsetting losing that friendship. I don't know, we just couldn't talk about it. We just couldn't talk. Welcome back to another episode of the Quill Etc. podcast. You're with me, Zoe Booth, and today I'm speaking with Roger Berkowitz. Roger is the founder and director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College in New York. He is a scholar who has dedicated much of the last few decades to promoting the work of Hannah Arendt. I think this conversation will be interesting not only for people who know about Hannah, but for people who have never really heard of her. Roger is an expert in her work, and you're going to learn a lot out of this conversation. If you do, please like it, share it, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And even better, visit quillette.com, where you can become a paid member and get access to all our articles, no more paywalls, and access to all our Quillette episodes. Without much further ado, let's get into this conversation with Roger Berkowitz. Roger, thank you so much for joining me today. To start with, I want to talk about why Hannah. What got you interested in her in the first place?
Wow. Well, it came in stages. I read her as an undergraduate, and I remember one of the first classes I ever had at Amherst College, George Kateb, who was a brilliant and is a brilliant political theorist, gave a lecture on Hannah Arendt and the human condition, and I wrote a paper on her as a freshman in college. But that's not the answer to your question. I went on to grad school. I got a PhD in jurisprudence, of all things, and I read a little Hannah Arendt in grad school. My first year in grad school, I took a course with Hannah Pitkin and read Hannah Arendt. But then the rest of my graduate school career, really, I was reading other things and doing other things. In my dissertation, which later became a book called The Gift of Science, she doesn't make an appearance. And then after a couple of years teaching in different places, I got hired to teach at Bard College, which is a liberal arts college in New York State. And she's buried there, and her library is there.
Why is that?
So a couple of reasons. Her second husband, Heinrich Blücher, was a professor at Bard for 17 years. And so Hannah and him they would rent a summer house nearby every once in a while. But she had a connection to Bard through him. But also she had become friendly with a student, a very brilliant student of hers named Leon Botstein, at the University of Chicago when she was teaching there. And later, when he was tapped at a very young age, at the age of 27, to become president of Bard, the faculty were a bit suspicious of this 27-year-old who might become their new president. And
what chutzpah.
What chutzpah, exactly. And Hannah, because she knew many of the faculty through her husband, Heinrich Blücher, but also because many of the faculty were also German emigres, she vouched for Leon Botstein and told the people that he would be a good president and that they should trust him. And so there was a connection both through her husband, but also Leon became the president, and through him she had a connection to Bard as well. And then when her husband died, he was buried in the cemetery at Bard, and she had a little bench erected, and she right in front of his grave, and she would come up and sit in front of his grave and read. And then when she died, she asked to be buried next to him at the cemetery at Bard. And then she left her library to the college as well. So somewhat fortuitous. And I was hired by Bard. I was not an Arendt scholar. And for a series of reasons, the year I was hired was 2005. And in 2006 was the 100th anniversary of her birth. And I went to the president and said, let's have a conference on Hannah Arendt. And he said, how do you want to do it? I said, I don't know. I'm not a Hannah Arendt scholar, but I think she's really fascinating. And why don't we just invite the 20 smartest people I know, ask them to come and not give academic papers, no papers allowed, just to talk about why Hannah Arendt matters about certain topics. And I listed like 20 topics, and I asked everyone to come and speak about a different topic. And we did, and it was this amazing conference called Thinking in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt on Ethics and Politics, Ethical and Political Thinking. And after that conference, her literary executor, Jerry Cohen, came up to me and said, I've been to 100 conferences on Hannah Arendt. This is the only one she would have loved. Would you guys start the Hannah Arendt Center? And I said, I'm not a Hannah Arendt scholar. And he said, I don't care. This is where we want it to be. And that's sort of how it happened.
So she was about practical philosophy, right? And so is that why she would have loved your conference, because it was less about, presenting papers and more about actually engaging in these ideas?
Yeah. She was someone who, she knew the history of philosophy inside and out. She also, as she would say, knew the canon of German poetry by heart. She wrote in 3 languages. But what I think really marks who she is, and I think what you mean by practical, is she wrote about the world. She was not interested in philosophy for philosophy's sake. Very famously, when she was interviewed on German TV in 1963, she was asked, she said, well, you're a philosopher. And she goes, no, I have to correct you. I'm not a philosopher. She didn't want to be called a philosopher. She didn't write in jargon. She didn't write in systems. She picked a topic, right? She was going to write about anti-Semitism. She was going to write about totalitarianism. She was going to write about education. She was going to write about freedom or authority. And she wrote about them using poetry and philosophy and history in this mixed up way that was very unique. And so people criticize her and they say, well, she's not a real philosopher. She's not a real historian. She's not a real this. And she's not. But what she is a thinker who brings an enormously wide erudition about the canon of Western thought to bear on particular issues. And one thing I'll say, Zoe, one of the reasons, people often ask me, how do you choose, who to read in the newspaper or in magazines today? And I say, I look for people who, when I read something they wrote on a topic, I don't know what they're going to say, right? People who I trust are going to come at the issue and say, how do I think through this problem in my way? And I'm not going to tell you what the liberal or the conservative or this. And that's what Hannah Arendt was, right? She looked at a problem. She tried to think it through. She didn't think she was doing it. She would tell you, I'm not getting the right answer. I'm getting the answer that's meaningful to me. And so one of her core ideas is that you give your opinion. You don't give the truth. There are no truths in politics. That's like one of the core ideas of her thought. There's only opinion. Now, there are better opinions and worse opinions, and there's persuasion, and you have to be able to justify your opinion in public. But all of her work is about her saying the way things appear and mean to her. And that's the beauty of her work.
So she believed there was no political truth, but the idea of objective truth in general, or moral truths of right and wrong, did she believe in that, or was she more of a, sort of post-structuralist?
So she certainly is, she would not have called herself a post-structuralist, but she would have said that she's a post-metaphysical thinker. She doesn't believe that there are any metaphysical truths. There are logical truths, right? Truths of logic. There are mathematical truths, but she doesn't think that there are any, she doesn't think there are moral or political truths that are objective. Now, it's an important distinction I'm going to make here. That doesn't mean that there aren't moral and political truths. But for her, moral and political truths emerge in a world that we share together through conversation. And as we talk to each other, we talk about the world. We talk about the things between us. In this case, it's hard to say because it's a Zoom thing. Normally, we would have a table between us, and we would share like some some sounds and stuff. But you're in Australia and I'm here in New York. It's sort of crazy. But the point is, we share this computer. We share the Zoom experience, right? And we build a shared world. And out of that shared world, we build a ground on which we stand, a common ground, and what she calls the sky above us, which we all can see. And that common world, she calls truth. You can't live without truth. We can't live if we don't have certain things we share. A lot of her work is about the increasing precarity of the common world.
So relevant to today.
So relevant today, but for her, it started in the 17th century. The precarity of the common world for her goes back to the scientific revolution, to the idea that the fact that we see the sun rise and set is part of our common world. And yet scientists tell us, no, the sun is not moving. We're moving around it. And so science begins to cast doubt on shared sense experience. And whereas we think of, many of us in the common sense world, think that science actually is based in common in sense in observation. She understood, and I think she was absolutely right about this, that science is actually fundamentally about mathematical truths, theories. We do make observations in science, but the observations have to fit theories. And the theories end up being what makes something true in science, not the observations. Observations can be faulty, can be, deceptive, etc. And so what science does is it turns us away from the common world we share into an inner world of our mind. And that's what she calls world alienation. So against someone like Karl Marx, who sees alienation through alienated labor, she says that the true source of modern alienation is the scientific world that makes us distrust our senses and thus turns us away from a shared world into a rational world of theories that are built often on, castles in the sand, things that don't really exist. And so this is what makes her very suspicious of intellectuals. She's always said that she distrusts intellectuals as a class more than any other class, because what intellectuals are good at is building theories upon theories upon theories that often have such a tenuous relation to whatever original observation that they started with that they become, castles in the air. And so she, was always noted for being friends with dock workers and local people. And she found that they were a more reliable group of people to talk to than professors, especially at top universities. She wrote, when she was teaching at Berkeley, she wrote back to friends that the only person she could stand talking to was this guy who was a dock worker who ended up being a very famous writer in the end. But she couldn't stand talking to her colleagues at the university. It's, and this is actually something that I think is very important. And a lot of Arendt scholars, especially in the universities, don't pick up this part of Arendt. She says that the greatest danger to democracy is the entry of intellectuals into politics. And because what intellectuals do is, again, take us away from the common world into these sort of theories and propositions that may be true at one point, but get built up into theories that then are so far into the world that no one can understand them, and they actually create, what she calls a consistent fictional world, which has to be protected against reality, and that's what she calls totalitarianism. And so, she's got this beautiful, it's really her thought is so original and so powerful that it's sometimes and even 70 years later, we look at it and say, she must be writing about today, but she was writing about a completely different time.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's dangerous to put labels on her. It's very difficult to label her. But when you're explaining this, words do pop into my head, descriptors, and some of those are, anti-science,
Well, she was not anti. I just want to be clear.
Populist.
Yeah, she's not anti-science, and she's not a populist. So how can I square that with what I just said? She believes that science is important in science. But a good scientist who maybe understands a lot more than I could ever understand about global warming, right? And what's going on in the world, has no better right to say what we should do about global warming than I do. And so she says, science belongs in science. Science should tell us the world is warming like this. The temperatures are increasing, temperatures are decreasing. That's facts. We should depend on science to give us facts. But that doesn't tell us what we should do. And that's what, and then so scientists have
it's like
to
stay in your lane in a way.
She says that scientists can only enter politics as citizens. They can't enter politics as scientists. They can publish their science, they can say the facts, but once they enter politics, they can't say, I'm a scientist, so I'm telling you what we should do. And that's a big difference. But we also have to be aware, but that doesn't mean that we can't depend on scientists to give us facts. There are facts. The earth is getting warmer over the last 100 years. That's a fact. Whether that means it will continue to get warmer, that's not a fact. That's a theory. Whether the way to fight it is by reducing our use of fossil fuels, or whether it's by killing half the population, or whether it's through using science to create ways to solve the problem, that's not science. That's politics. And she says there's no right answer to politics.
However, when we talk about, intellectuals being in politics, this is something that Trump talks a lot about too, that institutions, including, political parties, have been overrun by these intellectuals who have never actually had a real job in their life, and they've just spent their whole lives in these ivory towers of academia. But they're usually talking about social sciences, right? They're not usually talking about legitimate, hard science people like biologists and chemists and people like this.
Well, I mean, my understanding about Trump is he's talking about both. I mean, he doesn't want people in the EPA. He wants to gut the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He doesn't like them. I don't know, but I do think, I think that the general argument that intellectuals have too much power in our political society, and that bureaucrats and people in the civil service have too much power in our society, are arguments that Arendt would fundamentally agree with. She says that bureaucracy is the rule of nobody. And what she means by that is that, there's a story that a friend of mine tells where, there was a big flood, a tree fell in the river, and it flooded the whole town. So the town calls up the people with the chainsaws and say, go and cut the tree, so get it out of the river. And they say, well, okay, but we have to get permission from this group to do it. And that group says, no, we need permission of that group. And it takes 2 weeks to get permission to move the tree out of the river, because each bureaucrat is saying, I can't give that permission. It has to go to the next one. It's the rule of nobody. Nobody takes responsibility. It's the rule of offices rather than people. And she thinks that what bureaucracy does is it disempowers the people to self-govern themselves in a sort of small r Republican sense. And so, that's often considered by some people a conservative argument, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, self-government and citizen empowerment has a good left tradition. Thomas Jefferson, who's often considered to be on the left side of our founding fathers, was the founding father who was most worried about bureaucracy and the most interested in small r Republican self-government. So, and Arendt is a Jeffersonian in this regard. She cites a letter that Jefferson writes in 1816, in which he says that the greatest mistake that the U.S. Constitution made is they didn't provide an institutional space in the Constitution for citizens to govern. All they did was provide a sense for the politicians to govern. And Arendt says that this is the great mistake that the American Constitution made. You need to bring citizens. You need to have institutional spaces where citizens can actually engage in and be part of the political life. And that's one of the reasons that the Arendt Center, where I work and run, has gotten involved in this citizen assembly movement, which I know also has some legs in Australia.
Yeah, we call it, there's a different name for it here. I'm trying to remember. I know what you mean.
Yeah. So, but the point is that she is very suspicious of the claim of bureaucrats to rule. That doesn't mean so, but it's mixed for her, because she also thinks that you need a good civil service to do some things in an impartial way that will not be that where people don't pursue their own interest but pursue the common interest, and a good civil service should do that. But I think she was in the 1960s. She was already saying that the U.S. civil service had become so big and so bureaucratized that it was the great threat to democracy. And, the fact that Trump is saying it 60 years later doesn't mean that she would vote for Trump. But it does mean that I think the argument Trump is making is one she would share, right? Elon Musk just tweeted the other day that the great threat to tyranny is not Trump, it's Kamala Harris, because, you have the tyranny of the intellectuals and the bureaucrats. Hannah Arendt would, I think, clearly say that Trump is a bigger threat right now than Elon Musk, than the bureaucrats. But she would also agree with Elon Musk that the bureaucrats and the intellectuals and their power over cultural institutions, media institutions, and of course the government are a real threat to freedom and self-government. She would absolutely accept that line.
What do you think she would think about Elon's Twitter, X?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I don't like to answer the question of what she would think about something like that. But, I can tell you what I think about it. On the one hand, it could be a great democratizing thing where people can present themselves in the public sphere. The problem is that when you speak in public, usually you see who you're speaking to, and there are consequences to what you say, and you're a real person. And in general, I still believe, and I'm old-fashioned enough to believe this, that most people don't want to insult people to their face and don't want to be assholes. Excuse me if I can say that on this podcast. But on Twitter, that's just not true. You have bots, you have anonymous accounts, and you have people who think that because they're typing into the stratosphere, the metasphere or whatever, they can say whatever they want with impunity. And the result is that, I don't find, I'm not a big social media user. I don't find Twitter to be a great public, a public square. I mean, some people have tried to argue that it is. I have not found it to be so. I have a basic rule, which is I don't write anything political or controversial on Twitter. All I do is write informational stuff. I'm having a conference here. My book came out. I don't engage in opinions on social media because I find it to not be a fitting place to have a serious conversation. Obviously, that limits the audience I can have in certain ways, but I found it to be I don't find it to be a useful place to have a conversation.
I think that's a very healthy way to use social media.
But I mean,
I don't do it, but I'm trying to.
I have good friends who disagree with me and do it differently. But it is what it is. I have the one or two times I've tried to use it, I haven't liked it, and I felt dirty about it, and I felt I had to. I just was at a speech the other day, 2 days ago. Someone was saying that we're living in a time when Jews on campus are forced to either take a stand pro-Palestine or pro-Israel, and that they have to take the stand. And I said,
Are you a
no,
good
they
Jew
don't.
or a...
Yeah. Or, and I said, no, they don't. We can also engage publicly and talk, say it's a nuanced argument. And they said, well, not on Twitter. And I said, well, then you shouldn't be having the conversation on Twitter. I mean, that's the problem. If on Twitter you have to hit like or dislike, fine, but that's not a real conversation. A real conversation is where you and I sit around and we talk until we figure out what we agree on and what we disagree on. And we say, okay, we're allowed to disagree on some things, but let's focus on the fact that we actually have a basis of agreement. One of my favorite quotes of Hannah Arendt is where she says, speaking about justice and piety will actually make the world more just and more pious. And what she means by that is, if you and I sit down and we disagree, but we speak about what we disagree about, we'll find that we also agree on certain things. And thus, we'll raise the lowest common denominator, the floor of our justice and piety that we were with, up. And so speaking about the things that matter will actually lead to an increasing level of agreement. And I told you before that truth is the ground we stand on, right? We have to build that ground. She doesn't believe that truth is objective. It's not given by God. It's not given by reason. It's not given by science. It emerges out of conversation for her.
And I do worry that because so much conversation is now happening online, which is sort of an artificial way of conversing where, as you were saying, you don't see the other person's face. You're more likely to engage in, antisocial behavior. Because we're so used to speaking like that every day, many of us, especially younger generations, if that's actually, translating into conversations on campus, conversations in the workplace, if we're sort of copying that behavior that we engage in online, in person, that's concerning.
It is. I am hopeful in this regard. I mean, I find, I teach at a liberal arts college. I lecture around the world, so I spend my time in IRL, real life, with people talking. And, I have a rule, on the first day of my classes, I say, look, this class is designed to expose you to ideas and opinions that you're not going to agree with. In fact, what you're going to be surprised by is many of you in this room are going to disagree with each other about a lot of these things in ways that you probably don't expect. There's only one rule. No one is allowed to use what anyone says here by name and put it on social media. And they have to all agree to that in my classes. And I have found that people are able to agree in a very civil, meaningful disagree in a very civil and meaningful way. I don't find that it's that hard. They know how to do it when they're in a safe space for disagreement, or safe space for difficult thinking, as I like to call my classes. So I think they can do it. The bigger problem we have today is the problem of intellectuals that we were talking about before, that a lot of these kids come to college and they're taught by professors who are what we might call pseudo-intellectuals. And Arendt calls a pseudo-intellectual someone who is caught up in an ideology. And an ideology for her is an idea to logos, right? The truth of an idea. And the idea is that one idea is supposed to explain the whole world. So the Nazis had a racial ideology of anti-Semitism, that the Jews were the source of all the world's problems. The Bolsheviks had an ideology that said the bourgeoisie is the source of all the world's problems. There are a lot of ideologies. Environmentalism can be an ideology if it's taken too far. Racism is an ideology. Anti-racism is an ideology. But, most of them are not persuasive to the majority of people. The three ideologies in the world that have been most persuasive on a mass level so far have been Marxism, anti-Semitism, and racism. But we have seen in the last 20 to 30 years a new ideology emerge, which has taken over much of certain intellectual circles, which we can call a kind of post-colonial ideology. And this ideology says that, you know, certain people are always right and other people are always wrong. And in this case, depending on how you put it, wealthy, white, European people, usually men, are generally the oppressors, and everyone else is the is oppressed. And this ideology, which of course doesn't fit with reality, and like all ideologies, it takes one little idea and tries to apply it to a huge world that doesn't fit it. Um, has taken over large swaths of the intellectual world, and when you're committed to an ideology, you can't address facts that don't fit it. You just deny the facts, and unfortunately, we are seeing that happen on a regular basis, and many of our faculty and students are caught up in it. Yeah.
So Hannah died in 1975. So she would have crossed over with, the Frantz Fanons and the Stokely Carmichaels, and she would have been a fair bit older than them by that stage. But did she have any comments on this sort of bubbling decolonial thought that was becoming popular?
Absolutely. There's a little book of hers called Crises of the Republic, which is one of the books that I often recommend to people if they want a book to start reading Hannah Arendt. And it has some long essays in it, one called Lying in Politics, which is a great essay about the Pentagon Papers and about the place of lying in politics. One on civil disobedience, which I just published a new edition of. And one called On Violence. And this essay on violence, which is a long essay, it's like 70 or 80 pages, asks why it is that the new left has become obsessed with violence. And she discusses Fanon briefly in that essay. And she actually, says that Fanon gets a fair bit of this right, but Sartre, in his preface, gets it wrong. And it's Sartre who really says, the only good Frenchman is a dead Frenchman, and things like that. Fanon less so. But she is critical of the theorists of violence, that many people have now embraced Fanon to say he is. And she is critical of Sorel and many other theorists of violence in that essay. And so it's a great essay. And so she does take it on there. In that same book, Crises of the Republic, they publish an interview which she gave near the end of her life, where she's asked about post-colonial studies, and she calls it third worldism, and she says it's one of the most dangerous phenomena of our time. So yeah, she was clearly aware of it. She saw it as another ideology, like Bolshevism or like racism or like anti-Semitism. I don't think in the 1960s, when she gave these interviews, or early 1970s, she yet realized that they were going to become as powerful as they've become in the last 50 years. But she was certainly aware of them as ideologies back then.
I guess this leads us into a conversation about Zionism, because, if Sartre said the only good Frenchman is a dead one, I think it was Stokely Carmichael who said the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. And, this is rhetoric we're hearing on campus all the time. And which is, deeply...
Can I
yes.
just say, I just want to, I don't hear much, the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. I mean, I just want to not, I think there's probably 3 or 4 incidences that I've heard in the last year where someone has said something like this, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I just want us to be somewhat clear that most of the students who are pro-Palestinian are well-meaning, young, idealistic people, most of them who don't even know where Palestine is, um, who are upset. Look, there's two groups of them. There's three groups. There are ideologues. There are some who simply are upset at the fact that 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, which, by the way, I'm upset about too, and I think it's a tragedy. And I think that
How could it not be?
how could it not be? And I think it's simplistic to say Israel's at fault. I mean, you can also say that Hamas is at fault. There's a lot of fault to go around. But I mean, to be upset that this is happening, I have no problem with students protesting and putting up tent cities and saying that. When they stop Jews from going to certain buildings, and when they say that, you said the only good Jew is that, then it goes too far. And there are times it has gone too far. But I mean, I have no problem with young people being idealistic and protesting grave injustice. I also think they're getting it wrong because they're blaming one side and not the other. But,
Well, I was going to say actually that I had been, past tense, getting increasingly more upset about it. And I think part of it was that I was seeing a lot of stuff online, as we've already talked about. And your question, have we actually seen a lot of this? Have you personally heard it? I actually haven't heard that much in my personal life. I live in a very Jewish suburb. I myself am not Jewish, but I, have seen mostly happy, healthy Jews walking around, and yes, there's been a lot of, there have been protests, but thankfully, I've managed to avoid them. And every now and again, I see something in my IRL that is upsetting, but we can handle upset. That's okay. But yes, the most abhorrent things I've seen have actually been online, and I haven't personally had to experience it.
And I will say I have made the argument, and I will say the argument that I think you cannot separate the incredible single-minded blaming and single-sided blaming of Israel for what's going on from anti-Semitism. I just don't think you can. And the fact that not on campuses, but around the country and the world, synagogues have been attacked, Jews have been attacked. In my neighborhood on the Upper West Side, Jewish stores have been boycotted. Jewish stores have had their windows broken. Not a lot, right? Very few. I don't feel unsafe yet, but I have told my kids, if an Uber driver asks if you're Jewish, say no. I mean, there is anti-Semitism in the world, and the fact that the one Jewish country with 7 million Jews and 2 million non-Jews in it, in an area of 14 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the one Jewish country in the world is the prototypical example of a settler colonialist nation that is the blame for all white privilege and European colonialism in the world. Is such an abomination and such an exaggeration of anything that could be real in the world that you can't understand it without thinking that anti-Semitism is involved. Now, what is anti-Semitism is another question. Arendt spent her whole life writing about it. And one of the things that she importantly says is that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with dislike of Jews. Anti-Semitism is not about, anti-Semitism is what she calls a secular ideology in which one class of people blames the power structure or the state for their problems and associates the Jews with the state. And the Jews are associated with the state for a whole host of reasons. One, because in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, when nationalism and nation states started, the Jews were the bankers and the Jews were the state bankers. Then later, when equality emerged as an idea of the nation state, the Jews asked not to be treated equally, but to be given privileges because they didn't want to assimilate. They wanted to remain Jews. And so the Jews were seen as a people within a people, as outsiders, a people demanding privileges, people protected by the state. And it's the association of the Jew with the state at a time when people turn against the state, right? And you see that all over the world right now, where people think the state and the government are corrupt. The Jews are associated with the state. The Jews are associated with cosmopolitan intellectuals. The Jews are associated with power. That's anti-Semitism. And it has nothing to do with hatred of Jews. So I have colleagues of mine and friends of mine who says, how can you call me an anti-Semite? I love Jews. I have friends who are Jews, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, anti-Semitism has nothing to do with that. Anti-Semitism is an ideology in which you blame, in this case, a Jewish state and Jewish cultural predilections for, in this case, colonialism. Jews are not the origins of colonialism in the world. And to the extent that Israel is seen as the colonial state, I don't think you can separate that from anti-Semitism.
It's so interesting, and it reminds me that I don't think that I've met that many genuine racists in my life. I've seen a lot of racism, but have I met someone who, even the most sort of, I grew up in a big coal mining town in Australia, and it's, very working class, and I saw a lot of behavior or ideas expressed that would be classed as racist. But I saw these racists interact with other races at times, and there was no violence. There was a bit of a lack of understanding, and this is weird. But it wasn't a racism like, I think I deserve to live and you don't, and I think I'm better than you. There was and it's the same with misogyny. I've heard, sexism. I've seen sexism, but only a few times in my life have I met someone who I think is a genuine misogynist. And it's really scary because there's something deeply wrong with them. But, these people are rare. So
you're absolutely right, Zoe. And in fact, I have a book that I'm working on, and I have a long article that I just published making the distinction between racism and prejudice, which is a central distinction in Arendt's work, where she says, look, human beings are prejudiced, right? We all are prejudiced. I prefer to hang out with chess players or Arendt scholars over Harry Potter scholars and Quidditch players or whatever. I mean, we all have prejudices. You go down the street, who do you talk to based on all sorts of things? And she says, racism, though, is something very different. It's the ideological claim that certain people don't have the right to live or the right to be because of who they are. And she says racism is inhuman and is the end of humanity. But prejudice is actually deeply human. And so racism is an ideology that has very little to do with Jews or black people. In fact, it's often the most racist people are people who've never met a Jew or never met a black person. And yet prejudices, are real. And we have to sometimes address them because they can lead to injustices, but they're not dangerous in the same way as racism is. And so Arendt says that we have to learn to engage with prejudices, but we should try and end racism. But racism itself is quite rare. Prejudice is quite common, but full on racism, at least at this time, obviously 50 years ago was quite different in the United States. But at this time, out and out racism is quite rare, but prejudice is quite common, but it has to be dealt with quite differently. And she makes that distinction in a way that I think is ignored, but I think quite important.
Oh, I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but I know you don't have that much more time. We probably, we don't want it to go into the hours, but I do want to keep talking about this topic of Zionism. Arendt didn't describe herself as a Zionist, did she?
So she went through different phases, right? She was raised in a Jewish household, but not as a religious Jew and not as a Zionist. In 1932 and 33, she met Kurt Blumenfeld, who was the head of the German Zionist organization, and became friendly with him and was recruited by him to do work for the Zionists, and for which she was arrested and held in prison for about 5 days or 6 days. We don't know exactly. And then let out. She escaped. She went to Paris, where she worked for Zionist organizations in
Sorry, was
Paris.
this the Gurs concentration camp, or is that a
No,
separate
no,
incident?
that's separate. No, this
Okay.
was just, she was interrogated for her work as a Zionist. She
And she
charmed
charmed
the
yes.
policeman, and then he
Yeah.
let her out. She then went to France. She worked for Zionist causes. She even accompanied a group of children to Palestine at the time. She joined and she went to Zionist congresses. And then she was imprisoned in the Gurs camp. She walked out of it. She escaped, went to the U.S., worked for a Jewish press, Shockin', became the executive director of the Committee for Jewish Cultural Remembrance or Recollection. And so she was very involved in Zionist and Jewish projects at the time. She didn't really identify as a Zionist, but she was friends with many Zionists and very involved in them. And she became a proponent of what today we would call labor Zionism, along with Bernard Lazare and others, against the Jabotinskian version of Zionism. Revisionist Zionism. And she believed that Zionists should aim for a homeland in Israel, along with the Arabs and the Muslims, not a state not an ethno-national state. And once she realized in the 1940s, once she realized that the Jabotinsky ethno-nationalist revision strand of Zionism had won, she writes a series of essays bemoaning this fact, leading up to a very famous essay she wrote called Zionism Reconsidered, in which she basically says, given what Zionism has become, it's as dangerous as any other ethno-nationalism, and we have to oppose it. She was still a supporter of the state of Israel. She thought the Jews needed a homeland. She thought the Jews needed a place to be Jews. She thought the Jews needed a place to have political power, but she didn't believe in an ethno-nationalist state.
And I think this just shows why Hannah is so important, is that she criticizes the own movement she's part of or close to. And, I know that people, like that get called capos or self-hating Jews, or, if you're Black, you get called an Uncle Tom and all these things. And I think that's precisely, I actually don't always, agree with her, and watching or, reading her work is sometimes uncomfortable for that reason, because a lot of her criticisms, for example, in Zionism Reconsidered, is what I find very violent people today who are quite anti-Semitic, they do use these arguments of hers. And, anti-Semites or racists love when there's a person within that group who agrees with them. See, Jews also hate Israel. Jews also hate Zionism. They use her, but and that was people's issue with her during the Eichmann, when she wrote about Eichmann too. But she stayed true to what she believed in. She's very brave.
She's very brave. I mean, I always say that what I love about Arendt is she's a bold and provocative thinker. And I mean, as a woman at that time who took on male establishments all over the world, as a Jew who took on the Jewish establishment, as an academic who took on the academic establishment, as an intellectual who took on intellectuals. I mean, she is a free thinker, a self-thinker in the truest sense of the word. And let me just say, on the Zionist question, I mean, Arendt, in Origins of Totalitarianism, all the way back in the 1940s when she wrote it, published in 1950, was very clear that one of the great tragedies of Jewish history is that the Jews never had a state, and therefore they never learned how to have power. And she says that lack of experience with power is what led them to be taken advantage of and led them to not understand how to respond to the rising threat of Nazism in the 20th century. And so she was adamant that the Jews needed to learn to wield power. And the only way they could do that is if they had a homeland or a bastion of power. And she thought that was necessary. And so she was a Zionist in that sense. But she thought that a nation state where you had an ethno-nation state where at that point a third of the people were non-Jews could only lead to, uh, you know, tragedy. And she was right about that. And and that you're right. She is sometimes paraded out by anti-Zionists today as saying, look, she predicted, 60 years ago that Israel would become a racist state, and she was right. That's true. She did predict that, and I think she has been right. That doesn't mean she's an anti-Zionist in the sense that the Jews need a place where they can wield power. She would just be a dissident of a certain strand of that Zionism. She always said she never criticized the existence of the state of Israel, and she always celebrated it.
Mm-hmm. She was all for pluralism and diversity, and she loved this. And obviously that's partly why, she thought that Israel shouldn't be an ethno-nationalist state. Even though, Israel being Jewish, there are black Jews, there are white Jews, there are brown Jews, there are Asian Jews, so it's a bit more complicated than that. But was she a bit idealistic or utopian in the sense that she underestimated, she wanted Jews to be able to live with Muslims or Arab Christians in the same country? And I think maybe I'm biased. Of course I'm biased. Everyone's biased. But I think that Jews have usually shown that they can do that. And Jews can live. They've lived in the diaspora. They've lived in Israel, which is diverse in many ways. It's other people often that can't live with them very well. And Jews have had to be, dhimmis, have that dhimmi status. And in the Middle East, did she underestimate that it wasn't, that pluralism, while she might celebrate pluralism, and our some cultures do, other cultures don't, and perhaps Islam doesn't celebrate pluralism?
So there's different answers to that question, and it's a great question. First of all, she was not a politician, right? She was a thinker, and so she called herself a conscious pariah, someone who could stand outside of the political world and comment on it, not someone engaged in it. There were only very few times she engaged in politics, and one of them was in the Zionist question. She was on the side of the labor Zionists. She thought there should be a federation and that they should be able to live alongside the Arabs and the Jews there. The answer to your question on that point is, was she an idealist? We don't know because we never tried it. I think at this point, I think it's pure idealism to think that we could do that. I think it's pure idealism to think you could have a two-state solution at this point. Not to say I have another answer. I'm not a politician either. I just don't think it's going to happen. Could there have in the if in the 1920s and 30s, the Jews and the Arabs had leaders who brought them together and worked together to form a common world in which Arab power could exist and Jewish power could exist? Maybe. It could have happened. By 1945 and 46, when the Jabotinsky coalition had won, she says it's no longer possible and I'm exiting Jewish politics because I don't have an answer. So I don't think at that point she was an idealist. I think she was just a realist and said, I think we're in for a tragedy. And at that point, what she would say, although again, I don't want to speak for her, is, and I think you can judge this from what she wrote and did, what she would say is, I think it's an unjust situation. I think the Jews and the Arabs both have claims of justice on each side. I think the Jews are living unjustly as well as the Arabs. But I'm a Jew and I'll pick my sides, right? Um, and I think that's the kind of complicated answer she might give. Um, I don't think Israel's always just, but I'm a Jew and I pick my sides. I'm on the side of Judaism. And people can say to me, well, that's biased and that's prejudiced. And I'm like, yeah, I'm biased and I'm prejudiced. I don't know what you want me to tell you. As a Jew, I've learned over my life and by reading history that when Jews don't protect Jews, the bad things happen. And so I'm willing to be biased and prejudiced and I don't blame Arabs who are biased and prejudiced for Arabs. I think that's natural. I don't want them to be racist, and I don't want Jews to be racist. And I'm deeply critical of racist Jews. I think Ben Gvir and other people in Israel are horrible people. Just like I think, Sinwar and Hamas are horrible people. Sadly, we live at a time right now where the horrible people are in control.
Definitely. And yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, maybe I'll cut this out, but I've lost quite a few female friends. Funny that they were all girls. Yeah. Since October 7th. And most of them were white, but I lost one friend a French Algerian friend, and it didn't, it hurts that we're not friends, but, I so understood it. I was like, of course you're going to be pro-Palestine. Like, of course. No.
But why can't you, is there no ability to talk and find a common ground even with someone who's pro-Palestinian or not?
100%. And I didn't want to, I don't know why I get so emotional talking about this stuff. It was very upsetting losing that friendship. And I don't know, we just couldn't talk about it. We just couldn't talk.
So I just finished a book that it's not out yet, but it's a book on Hannah Arendt and politics and friendship and politics. And there's a lot to say about it, but there's a series of letters that Hannah Arendt writes with Gershom Scholem, who was a great Jewish scholar, Kabbalist, and ended up in Israel. And first, after her essay, Zionism Reconsidered, he gets very mad at her and criticizes her for it. And they have an argument. And then later again in 1963, after the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, he criticizes it again in a very famous letter exchange that they then published. And at the end of her response, she says, I hope we can have this disagreement and still be friends, but I'm not sure you can do that. And that may be because you're a man and men are used to having their own way. And you're upset that you can't get me to simply agree with you. And, but from her point of view, she could disagree with people violently, and she still insisted that that's what friendship was. She writes to Kurt Blumenfeld, who also criticized her for her essays on Zionism, that friendship happens on the knife's edge, that you have to be able to argue and really disagree and almost hate each other, and yet still insist that our common respect for each other preserves our friendship. And this knife's edge of friendship is one of the great insights of her work. And it has a connection to politics, because she says that the core of politics is not love, where you sort of just love each other deeply, but it's friendship, where you learn to disagree with each other, but also respect each other as citizens. And we find what we hold together despite our disagreements. And so that friendship is the model for her idea of politics as well.
That's nice, because you don't usually think of politics and friendship in the same as having a similar relationship.
Well, when the book comes out, you'll read it.
Okay.
And we'll come back and talk about it.
I will. Yeah. I think we will need to have another discussion about this, but maybe just to end, I wanted to do some sort of rapid fire questions if you're down for that.
Okay.
Did Hannah see Jews as a tribe? What did she see as Judaism?
That's a great question. Rapid fire. She says that once the glory of Jews was that they believed in God, and that was what, and that humility is what made them great. Today, too many Jews see themselves as a tribe, and that tribal, she believed, she called her group of friends a tribe, but it was a tribe of all groups of friends, of Jews, non-Jews, people from all over. She thought tribalism was quite important, but she didn't think it should be ethno-tribalism. The one thing she says is that in a world in which people don't attack you as a Jew, you don't have to identify as a Jew. But as soon as people attack you as a Jew, you have to defend yourself as a Jew. And but I don't think she would be comfortable with thinking of Jews as a tribe. For her, being Jewish was a fact of life. She was born Jewish. It's a fact of her that she doesn't want to deny. For her, it wasn't the central fact of her life. But when other people made it the central fact of her life, she would announce it fully and not retreat from it.
What about her sex, her gender?
So
was that a big part of her thinking?
No. She often, she often would say that she was not a feminist or things like that. But she would often say that, like what I quoted you before, she said that people like Sholem, one of the reasons they didn't like her is because she didn't bow to them as a woman. So she was clearly had certain ideas that we would today call feminist, but she also would say, it's not a problem for women to cook, and not a problem for women to be in the household. She was famously, even though she was much more famous than her husband Heinrich Blücher, who taught at Bard, when people came over to the house, she put on an apron and she did the cooking.
Yeah, that intrigues me so much about her. I watched that interview on German TV with, what was his name?
Gunther Stern.
That one. Yeah.
No, not Gunther Stern. Gunther Gauss. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Gunther Stern was her first husband.
And it really captivated me. And that's part of, I watched that interview and straight away I reached out to this, I started reading her, and then I reached out to the center on Twitter and organized to do this conversation because I was just captivated by her. And I find something about her very, very attractive, that she's actually, she's not a traditionally, beautiful or attractive woman, but she's got this charm and I don't know, something very charming about her. And she starts off the conversation by talking about her gender, and that something like it's not a good or attractive sort of world to be in as a woman. Like, I'm paraphrasing. Do you remember what she?
Well, I mean, she says, "Look, I am a woman, and it's given me certain disadvantages and certain advantages. But I have no desire to change the fact that I'm a woman."
Immer, und ich bin eigentlich altmodisch gewesen. Ich war immer der Meinung, es gibt bestimmte Beschäftigungen, die sich für Frauen nicht schicken, die ihnen nicht stehen, wenn ich einmal so sagen darf. Es sieht nicht gut aus, wenn eine Frau Befehle erteilt. Sie soll versuchen, nicht in solche Positionen zu kommen, wenn ihr daran liegt, weibliche Qualitäten zu behalten. Ob ich damit recht habe oder nicht, weiß ich nicht. Ich selber habe mich irgendwie mehr oder minder unbewusst, oder sagen wir besser mehr oder minder bewusst, danach gerichtet. Das Problem selber hat für mich persönlich keine Rolle gespielt. Sehen Sie, ich habe einfach gemacht, was ich gerne machen wollte. Ich habe mir nie überlegt, ob eine Frau das nun machen, dass das gewöhnlich Männer machen oder jetzt macht es eine Frau oder so. Es hat mich eigentlich persönlich nicht berührt.
Ich verstehe.
She doesn't embrace a feminist ideology. She doesn't, she's like, I don't mind being a woman, and I don't mind being. And by the way, when she was young, she was quite beautiful.
Yeah, I didn't want to be offensive.
No,
She was
no, but
beautiful.
she was gorgeous, actually. If you see pictures of her when she was young,
Yeah, yeah,
and and she had an affair with Martin Heidegger,
yeah.
and she was quite she had men all over the world proposing to her, even when she was older. Partly because she was just so charismatic. She had what they say now is riz.
When she smokes, and she's just so enchanting. Yeah,
exactly. And she had no problem being a woman in that feminine way.
Exactly.
But she also spoke with an incredible, not only erudition, but power and forcefulness that both captivated and offended some men.
Did she talk about being a mother or not becoming a mother?
She may have mentioned it once or twice. I mean, she was born in 1906. She was a refugee from 1933 until 1950. So by the time she was a citizen of a country, she was 44.
Wow. I didn't think about that.
So, I think for her, she never felt safe. Even when she first got to America, she and her husband, especially Heinrich Blücher, who had been a Spartacus, so a radical communist, had lied on his immigration papers that he had not been a communist and things of that sort. And they were always worried about being deported. And so they really didn't feel stable until the late she published Origins of Totalitarianism in 1950, about when she got citizenship. She became famous. But then she was 44 years old. And, I'm not saying she couldn't have had kids, but at that point, I think it was for her no longer a real question or option.
Could have been like Rachel in the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? But I don't think she really was desperate to have kids, but I think a lot of it was life situation. I mean, she lived through hell. I mean, she was a refugee for 17 years. So.
Okay, well, I think we should finish it up there. But could you please, tell our listeners a little bit about what you do at the center? I know you do a Friday night reading sort of class. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Hannah Arendt Center is not a mausoleum for Hannah Arendt. We don't. It's not just about people coming in, sitting around and doing research on Hannah Arendt, although we certainly welcome people who want to do that. We have her library at Bard, and people come from all over the world to consult it and use it. But we really try and, in the spirit of Hannah Arendt, talk about the world in a provocative, bold, and original way to the extent we can. We're not Hannah Arendt, but we make an effort to do that. And we do that in many ways. Every Friday afternoon in the United States at 1 o'clock. So what time is Friday at 1 o'clock in Australia? Is that Saturday?
It's in 2 hours from now. I'm ahead of you. So
yes.
You're Thursday night. So so that would be, yes. That
Friday,
would be
1
Saturday.
o'clock at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m.?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
It'd be our Saturday.
Okay. So sometime on Saturday, we at 1 o'clock Eastern time in the United States, we do an online virtual reading group where we read through books of Hannah Arendt chapter by chapter, and I give an opening lecture, and then we have questions and discussions. And it's grown into a really amazing community of people who now have side dialogue groups where they talk about issues during the week. And it really has become an incredible intellectual community of people from all political parties, from different sides, we have people from refugee camps in Syria. We have people from Russia. We have people from Iran. We have people from Brazil, people from Australia. Not as many from Australia because of the time, but it's amazing, and that's open to anyone who's a member of the center. You can become a member. Our general membership is $100, but we say give whatever you want. We have people become members for $1. So it's open. Those meetings are also video recorded and put on YouTube, and you can watch them. We also then edit them and make them into a podcast called Reading Hannah Arendt with Roger Berkowitz. Very original title. You can listen to the podcast versions of them on your podcast thing. We also have an annual conference every year on a different topic. Last year it was on politics and friendship. This year it's called Tribalism and Cosmopolitanism. So very much some of the things we were just talking about. And that conference this year it's always around the anniversary of her birth, October 14th. This year it's October 17th and 18th, Thursday and Friday at Bard College. It is live simulcast, so you can watch it if you can't make it to Bard. And then, of course, later the videos are put on YouTube on our YouTube channel. So we do a wide range of things. We have a journal that comes out once a year of largely edited speeches that have been given at the center. So it's very non-academic, not articles, but speeches meant for a wide audience. So we have a wide range of public events that hopefully appear, and that, and we have about 700 paying members around the world who join our events and support what we do. And we have another 30,000 people who read our newsletter, comes out every Sunday, or join in on our podcast or our virtual reading group.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do at the center. And I, for one, have really loved, learning more about Hannah and reading her work. And you do really important work in keeping her work and her thoughts alive. And
I appreciate it. I thank you. And I think her work is so deeply relevant today, but it's relevant because it's difficult. And a lot of people simplify her. And I think one of the things we really try and do at the center is say, look, the reason to read her is not because she's going to support your side, but it's because she's going to make you think and challenge your opinions. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Zoe.